Hello, my name is Drew Burchett. I'm a principal real estate broker licensed in Oregon, and I live here in Portland, Oregon. So if you're watching this, you're probably getting ready to write an offer on a hot property in a multiple offer situation. So I just wanted to put this video together just to talk about all of the different items there are, all the different terms that we can play with to get your offer accepted. So as a blanket statement, I'm not saying you should do any of these things. I'm just laying out what the menu of options are that are out there. Some of the things I'm going to talk about are kind of crazy and I advise you don't do them, but just know that other people will. Okay, I'm about to go over a whole bunch of stuff with multiple offer situations. I know this is a super emotional thing, and I know it's hard when you find a place that's like super perfect and now you got to deal with all this stuff. So there's a whole bunch of conversations we can have about this. This is just starting the situation off on the right foot. And if you're watching this during the summertime, this is what I look like during the winter with a beard. So the first thing we can talk about is price. It's kind of obvious. Price is the thing that matters the most. And every multiple offer situation has a different flavor. There's different sizes and shapes of multiple offer situations. If you've got 2 or 3 offers you're going up against, that's one thing. If you're going up against 8, 9, or 10, that's something completely different. So it kind of starts with price. So we've looked at the house. Let's just say hypothetically it's listed at $500,000 and you've got some interest. So the first thing I'm going to do is send you an email with comparable properties from the neighborhood so you can get a sense of what the going rate is for that size and stature of a house in that location. So you sort of have to review the comps, see what those sales have been going back a year or whatever it is, and you kind of have to put that aside and then see how this multiple offer situation shapes up. So the comps are really just like a baseline starting point, but really where that number lands is going to depend on how many offers are in, how much of a frenzy it is with the competition, and also what it's worth to you. So that's one thing I would encourage you to think about when you're looking at the numbers, like what is it worth to you? What is your walk away number? And I can definitely help craft all that, but then also like what's crazy town? Like what is the crazy town number? And sometimes multiple offer situations go into crazy town and sometimes they don't. So while you're watching this video, what I'll be doing is communicating with the listing agent, trying to get as much information out of them as I can possibly. So if the listing has just gone live recently, they probably won't even know a whole lot. Sometimes agents will share kind of exactly where you need to be on numbers, and sometimes they'll be pretty aloof about it. So I do my best to dance with them and just glean as much information as I can so that you can make empowered decisions. Aside from price, there are a bunch of other terms that we can incorporate into the offer to make your offer stand out from the other ones. So let's start with inspections. So the typical inspection period is 10 business days. So for a multiple offer situation, usually we're gonna want to reduce that time to 6, maybe 7 days. 6 is kind of pushing it, 7 is no problem. So that gives us plenty of time to get the inspector out there, do the sewer scope, do the radon, do the tank sweep, and then hopefully get any contractors out there that we need to. So we can shorten up the inspection period and it really doesn't affect the transaction very much. And at the end of the day, if something does come up and we need extra time to get an engineer out or a contractor, we can extend. Usually the seller will acquiesce to extend the inspection period, so it's not that big of a deal. So we can also take some of the inspections off the table. You can forego the sewer scope, you can forego the radon test. I would not advise foregoing the sewer scope, but foregoing the radon test is not that big of a deal. Radon is a serious health hazard and we don't want to screw around with it, but fortunately the mitigation system, it runs in the $1,600 range, so it's not a $20,000 problem, but it's something you definitely want to get tested for at some point. So we can take some of those things off the table. The one thing, this is one item that is a pretty contentious, especially with first-time buyers, is doing an as-is purchase. So there's kind of a spectrum of as-is, and interestingly, the boilerplate sales agreement has an as-is clause in it. So basically what it says is that the seller is not obligated to do any repairs per the contract. So it's already written in there, But by just reiterating it, I've found that that can really help to win the day. So on the light end of the spectrum with as is, the way we write in the contract, it basically just says as is purchase, period. And then what I do is when I send the offer over to the listing agent, I'll explain what I mean by that. So what I mean is that we're not going to ask for any repairs, but if something comes up like a failing roof or a failing sewer line or a foundation issue or something along those lines, we'll negotiate a partial credit. So that would be a credit that goes towards your closing costs. So the amount of credit you can actually negotiate is limited by your closing costs. So if your closing costs are $12,000 and we negotiate a $15,000 credit, then we kind of negotiated $3,000 too much. So if you don't use it, you lose it. But there are ways we can incorporate that and fix those problems if it does arise. So that's the easy end of the spectrum of as is. And in any competitive situation, I almost always recommend we go with that, because if we don't, someone else will. And that can really make your offer stand out. On the further end of the spectrum with as is, you can say as is purchase, no credits, no repairs, no concessions of any kind. So that is one that I don't often recommend. The only time I would do it is if it's a seriously competitive situation and the house is just completely dialed, where you can look at all the systems inside and out and everything's squared away. But still, it's not the best. The other thing you can do on that far end of the spectrum too is waive the inspections. 17 years in this business, I've only ever written that into a contract one time, and we still didn't get it accepted because that was a seriously competitive situation. So that's really not a good idea. So one of the other threads that we can tug on is the appraisal. So usually just about every contract I write in that will order the appraisal within 3 business days of mutual acceptance. So per the contract, the appraisal has to be ordered before the end of the inspection period, which is usually 10 business days, but ordering it right away has kind of become a standard thing, because what we'll do is we'll order it, but then we won't have the appraiser out until inspections are negotiated or repairs are negotiated. So ordering it right away is just a good timeline thing, and it's something I put into the contract, and it does make your offer a little bit stronger. So another thing about the appraisal that we can put in there, and this is kind of a more complicated one, is to kind of pre-negotiate an appraisal issue. I did a whole nother video about appraisals, so you should probably watch that to get more of an explanation on how appraisals work and all that. But so the way the language on the contract would read is the buyer agrees to bring an additional X number of dollars to closing in the event of a low appraisal to fill the gap. So that X, it's got to be $10,000 at least to be effective, but $10, $20, $30,000. Basically what you're saying is that if the appraisal comes in low, we're going to bring extra cash to fill the gap. So if that happens, that money's not going to the ether. It's really additional down payment funds. So your loan amount is going to be a little bit less than it would have been, but those funds fill the gap. So it's something you'd have to have that money in reserves. And there's ways we can restructure your down payment percentage to make it so that maybe you end up with the exact same down payment. So yeah, that's called the appraisal gap filler. And that's something we can talk about more, but if you watch that appraisal video that I did, and I'll put a link at the end of this so you can see that, that'll help explain more about the appraisal. One more note on appraisals is it is an option to waive the appraisal contingency. So if you're gonna do that, you basically have to be able to cover any gap in the appraisal, the appraised value versus the purchase price. That's kind of a bigger conversation, but it is possible to waive the appraisal contingency. Another item we can toy with is the closing timeline. So typically, a typical closing is 30 days from acceptance to closing. Usually sellers want to close as quick as humanly possible. So sometimes we can shorten that. We need to check with your lender to see what their actual turnaround time is now. Like sometimes lenders can close in 2.5, 3 weeks. That's really pushing it. But 4 weeks, 30 days, a month is kind of the normal closing time period. But also too, sometimes sellers want a 45-day close or a 60-day close. 45 days is doable. 60 starts to be problematic because of rate locks and all those things. But you know, meeting the seller's needs on their closing timeline is really important. And that's one of my jobs, is to find out what the sellers are actually looking for and not making assumptions on it. So, but any time we put a closing date in the contract, we want to run it by the lender just to make sure that it's actually doable. But you can make your offer stand out by being closing a week sooner than everybody else. Another thing on that front is possession. So, you know, these days, a lot of sellers want rent back. So the sale closes on the 30th and they want 2 weeks to move out of the house, or sometimes they want 2 months so they can find their new house and close on that. So offering up a rent back to the seller can be really beneficial to your offer. So in a perfect world, you can offer them a rent back where they pay you. Typically what we do is 1/30 of your PITI. So that's principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. It's essentially 1/30 of your mortgage per day. So if the seller's staying and they're paying you that, then there's no cost to you. They're just basically living in the house you just closed on, which I know is not a great idea. But if it's super competitive, it's pretty common for people to offer free rent back. So you basically let the sellers stay in the house for 30 days, 60 days after closing at no cost before you get the keys to move in. I know that can be a tough pill to swallow after just closing on your house, but sometimes that's what it takes to get the offer accepted, because a lot of people will do free rent back. So in a particularly wild, competitive, multiple offer situation, the earnest money starts to come into play. So the earnest money is basically your deposit. It's usually 1% of the sales price, and it goes towards your down payment and closing costs. But again, using a $500,000 purchase, so that would usually be a $5,000 earnest money. So if you want to get wild with the earnest money, you can go up to 10. With that type of a price point, I usually don't recommend going above 10, and there's some legal reasons involving small claims court and things like that we don't have to get into. So you can do a higher earnest money, and then another thing you can do is release the earnest money at a certain point in the process. So you can agree to release the earnest money after the inspections, you can agree to release the earnest money immediately, and there's some different languages about releasing the earnest money. The weaker language is to say it's released. The stronger language is to say it's released and non-refundable. So anyway, you're sort of saying that if the sale goes sideways or I get cold feet or anything like that, the seller gets to keep the earnest money. As a side note, it's pretty rare that the earnest money is ever surrendered to the seller in a typical transaction. I've had very few instances where it's come into play in my career. So releasing it to the seller, it's kind of saying that like you're buying this house, period. Again, I usually don't recommend doing that unless it gets to be a super wild situation, and you know, if that $10,000 doesn't mean as much to you, maybe it's easier to do, but it's usually not the best idea. Escalator clauses. I'm sure that you've heard about an escalator clause at a dinner party with your friends who just bought a house. It's something that there's a lot of information out there about escalator clauses, and there's a lot of misinformation out there about them. So what an escalator clause is it's an addendum that we put to your offer that says, here's the sale price, we'll say $500,000, and we'll say the buyer is willing to pay $5,000 more than the next highest offer, up to a total amount that is, say, $550. So that $5,000, that can be, you can make that any increment you want. You can make it $1,000, you can make it $10,000. It's basically saying I'll trump anyone else's offer by this amount, and then we cap it at the top. My opinion is that if you're going to do an escalator, $5,000 is the minimum you want to do to beat the next lowest offer. I've gotten escalator clauses on my listings where it's $1,000 over. I'm like, come on, you got to do a little bit better than that. And then depending on the price point, and sometimes you got to go 10 or 15,000 over the next available. So there is a time and a place for an escalator clause. Sometimes the seller is not allowing them. So basically the terminology is they want highest and best. So no escalators, just give us your best price, period. Other times, there are times where an escalator clause is prudent. I'd say it's a pretty low percentage, 20%, maybe 25% of the time where it's possible or prudent to do one. Other times you can really shoot yourself in the foot by doing an escalator clause. I can explain that in more detail. It's too much to do on this video. But I've seen it from the listing side where people get a little conservative doing escalator clauses and they end up elevating their offer higher than it would have needed to be if they would have just been firm on an actual number. There's another thing that has kind of come in and out of legality here in the last couple years is love letters. So basically a love letter is you writing a couple paragraphs to the seller, gushing about the house, telling him how much you love it, including a photo of yourself, your family, maybe your dog, and that can be the difference between getting the offer accepted and not, because that way the seller can make more of a personal connection with you. So there was a period of time, a year and a half or so ago, where these were outlawed in Oregon. Now I'm starting to see them, I think that law was overturned, so I'm seeing them start to come back into play. It is a little bit dangerous because there's a whole bunch of fair housing issues that this brings up, and I'm really not a favor of love letters anymore, but I am starting to see people use them again. So if you do want to do a love letter, I can send you some examples, and usually what I do is I have you just write like a Word document, and then I'll just edit it just by paring it down. I just remove things. I don't change the content of it. I just make it so that it fits the situation better, because there are some things that you shouldn't share with the seller, and we can get into that if we come to actually doing a love letter. So a super strong offer usually is going to incorporate some of these things, some of these bullet points we talked about here, and have a really good price. Before we put together an offer that's super strong like that, I'm going to do my best to glean as much information from the listing agent as I can to make sure that we're not overdoing it. And then on top of that, we're going to do as much research about the property prior to waiving anything or shortening anything or selling the farm. There's an awful lot of information out there on Portland Maps and in the world where we can research a good number of these things, so there's not any big surprises with inspections. But still, the more out on a limb you go with the terms, the more risky it gets. Again, just to reiterate, I'm not saying you should do any of these things. This is just the menu of what's out there. And yes, there are people that will write crazy offers, and they will do this stuff as crazy as some of it seems. So I hope this was helpful. I'm here for you to talk through all these things as we put the actual offer together, and let's get this one accepted.